Hello everybody. Hamza Tzortzis has been portraying himself as an expert on consciousness. I have already produced several videos highlighting his rudimentary knowledge of consciousness. He has since produced a nearly 3-hour long webinar on this topic. I was surprised to see that he had actually better and more sophisticated arguments this time and had offered some counter-arguments to the rebuttals of his earlier videos. I postulated that he wanted to push theism as an answer in his earlier videos. This is confirmed here. A lot of the presentation is in the form of slides, which for brevity I will allow you to read rather than listen to the explanation. He starts off by posing this question.
Well, intuitively, we're going to say, no, that's not the case. Why? Because the stone is cold, it's dead, and it's blind. In other words, it doesn't have any intentional force. It cannot see anything. It's not aware of itself. It's not aware of anything outside of itself. In other words, in the language of consciousness or the philosophy of the mind, it has no intentionality. It is not about or of something. There is no awareness. It doesn't have the ability to contain meaning, if you like. So the stone is unable to feel the flutterings of a bunch of butterflies. Now, I want you to remember this stone for later. And the reason I'm mentioning this, because if you think about it, if this universe is what you would call a universe that is physicalist, or it's in line with metaphysical naturalism, which is basically the view that there is no God, there is no divine, there is no supernatural, there is no non-physical, and everything can be explained by physical phenomena in some way, then the reality is, well, this whole universe is like a stone.
So the first ridiculous argument he makes is that if there is no God, no divine or supernatural, then the whole universe is like a stone. This may be his philosophy, but most people can attribute meaning and purpose without it being directed by a deity. He explains his definitions of physicalism and materialism used in this presentation. This is the outline of his presentation. He explains the hard problem of consciousness and why he thinks physicalism can't explain it. He then explains why theism gives a better explanation for consciousness. If you're thinking this sounds like a God of the Gaps argument, then you are absolutely correct. He then finishes off by saying why consciousness proves that his God is worthy of worship. We can totally ignore that bit. There is a good definition of the hard problem of consciousness. He then explains eliminative materialism, followed by another materialist explanation, which is reductive materialism.
Weak emergent materialism says, look, we will eventually understand subjective conscious experience when we understand the complex processes that are involved.
Unlike in his earlier videos on consciousness, he does make an attempt to offer a rebuttal to the notion that consciousness is an emergent property and that he is committing a composition fallacy by not seeing how consciousness could arise from physical matter.
Yeah, the fallacy of composition, you have to apply that logical fallacy.
Exactly.
It's not a universe. Yeah. For example, the logical fallacy can be understood like this. So if you have a Persian rug is very heavy, right? So each thread of the Persian rug is very light.
Exactly.
So yeah, you can apply the logical fallacy because we can't now say the Persian rug is made of many light threads, therefore the Persian rug is light. It just doesn't follow.
Yeah.
However, it's not fallacious to say that each brick is hard.
Yeah.
And
therefore the brick wall is hard. Yeah.
Therefore the brick wall is hard. You're not going to say now it's soft, right?
Exactly.
Because it's about you have to understand it in its application with regards to quality.
We have examples of Persian rugs being heavy, even though each fibre is light. We don't have any examples of a brick wall being soft, even though each brick is hard. You can't equate that to consciousness, so this is just a stupid analogy.
Strong emergent materialism. I like this one. This one's funny. Yeah. So this form argues that subjective consciousness is a natural phenomenon. It's physical. However, any physicalist theory that attempts to address this reality is beyond the capacity of the human intellect.
He again here tries to argue against emergent properties.
So they say, look, no. Emergent materialists say, look, and this is the famous H2O example. They say, look, we know that you can have an emergent property that cannot be found in the individual physical components or physical processes. So therefore, emergent materialism is coherent. And they use water as an example. So the H2O example, it's water. It's this shiny, transparent liquid. But the properties of shiny and transparent cannot be found in the individual processes or the individual components like oxygen and hydrogen. But yet you have this property that emerges as a result of this complexity. Now, one would argue, is there a complexity here? But that's a different question. But for argument's sake, let's say there is a complexity going on. There are 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, and they physically relate and combine and connect in some way. And you have this emergent property called water. Well, that is water, but the property is shiny liquid. And you can't find shiny liquid in the individual components here or the individual parts. Is that clear?
Clear.
So that's their way of saying, look, emergent materialism makes sense. However, Raymond Tallis, he's actually an atheist. He's a humanist. So he basically says, and let's unpack what he says. Let's read it first. He says, the most obvious trouble with the view that neuroactivity on the one hand and experiences on the other are the same thing is that they should appear like one another. But nothing could be further from the truth. As it is, nerve impulses seem required to have 2 sets of appearances at the same time that are profoundly different from one another, an appearance of electrochemical activity and an appearance of experience of something other than themselves. Both shiny water and H2O molecules need to be revealed as one or the other. They correspond to 2 different modes of observation. The 2 aspects of water are 2 appearances, 2 modes of experiencing it, and this hardly applies to neuroactivity as electroactivity and experience. So he's already making this kind of almost metaphysical ontological distinction that, look, neuroactivity and phenomenal experience in a subjective conscious experience, it's not the same as H2O and shiny water, because H2O and shiny water are just 2 modes of experiencing the same thing. But neural activity and inner subjective conscious states, they're not the same thing. That's what he's basically arguing.
Consciousness could still be an emergent property. This recent review, which I will link in the description, shows how life shows emergent features through to complex brains through progressive stages. We can see that consciousness is not present or absent, but there is a spectrum of consciousness. This table shows the evolution of life, followed by nervous systems and then finally consciousness. If we see consciousness as more than just an aggregate of neural function, but as an emergence through a hierarchy in a complex system, it makes more sense. This next section covers AI and whether AI could be fully conscious. Hamza Tzortzis concludes that it can't. This is still debatable. Some philosophers and cognitive scientists think that it could eventually be fully conscious. For the purpose of this discussion, let's give him this point and agree that AI can't be fully conscious and that consciousness can only occur in biological organisms. This still wouldn't advance his theistic argument for consciousness in any way.
If AI does become fully conscious, hypothetically, strong AI, AI becomes strong AI, not just weak AI, they would argue that, well, that would support the view that human consciousness is based on physical functional processes and interactions. In other words, phenomenal consciousness, inner subjective conscious states is going to be reduced to physical processes. So this would imply that human consciousness could have emerged without anything external to the natural world. In other words, there is no need for a soul or divine intervention. But I would still argue, even if that's the case, it doesn't necessarily mean that religion or theism is undermined, because it could be argued that God uses physical functional processes to bring about consciousness. However, it just does not require something non-physical to ensure the emergence of consciousness. But fundamentally, it may do, because we know all of contingent reality, which is physical reality, derives its existence from a necessary being that is not contingent, and therefore it's not physical.
The contingency argument has its flaws, but if you are determined to stick with it, then you can always put your deity at the start of any process, but that might not be the most reasonable or rational thing to do.
Here's the smackdown argument to expose neuromania, right? Yeah. And here's the smackdown argument. Number one, neuroscience assumes, there's a spelling here, sorry. Neuroscience assumes a physicalism or physicalist metaphysic. Yeah. Number two, physicalism cannot address the problems of phenomenal consciousness or the hard problem of consciousness. Number three, therefore, neuroscience cannot address the problem of phenomenal consciousness or the hard problem of consciousness. Because no matter what neurobiological studies that you have, the neuroscience itself and neurobiology is going to be based on a physicalist assumption.
Number one, science has to assume physicalism, as there is no way to investigate non-physical or non-material factors. Number two, that's just your assertion which isn't supported by the evidence. Number three, that's just another assertion of yours. If we grant Hamza Tzortzis this argument for the purpose of this discussion and assume that all three of his premises are correct and that neuroscience can't address the hard problem of consciousness, that's all it would mean. It would not mean that there is a non-physical element or that there is a theistic cause for consciousness. He then goes into his theistic explanation.
So we need a more coherent explanation for the existence of subjective conscious experience. And we would say is that God, Allah, created consciousness.
If your solution to the hard problem of consciousness is that there is a non-physical entity, then can you explain how would a non-physical entity interact with a physical? How could you test for the non-physical entity? How can you explain head injuries and drugs and medication and general anesthesia where people lose consciousness? If you say it's because consciousness is reliant on a functioning brain, then how can you exclude it as an emergent property? Can you explain why consciousness is a spectrum and not a distinct entity? This is just a God of the Gaps argument with no predictive power or practical usefulness. Thank you for watching, and please let me know what you think in the comments section.